give everyone a very warm welcome from Michel Bauwens from the P2P Foundation.
Hello. To me falls the difficult task of keeping you awake after this amazing lunch. I'll have to keep myself awake too. Okay, so I know that Dougald has preceded me with this insight a long time ago when you did Dark Mountain. But I think it's good to remember that we really live in dangerous times. Think about the refugee crisis, dislocation of the state system in the Middle East, the protectorate of Greece, and a lot of things are happening today that, the kind of order we used to, for some people was order at least, is really dislocating quite rapidly. And so the more important in that context that people take a new look at their conditions, life conditions, provisioning systems, etc. And I guess some people have called me a pathological optimist, so I'll just take that as a compliment. Not because I think that things are automatically getting better, but because when you look at what people are doing, I think there's reason for hope. People are really questioning the dominant systems, and they're not just talking about it, they're actually doing things. And I've had the luck of traveling quite a bit recently, and so like you in your 2012 trip, to see really amazing projects about everywhere. There is a Dutch graphic which I like to show. I don't have it with me, but you can imagine it. It's in a little booklet called Homo Corporans from Tina de Moor, and she shows that since 2005 in the Netherlands, there's an exponential growth in civic, non-state, non-corporate initiatives. So yes, I know at the same time the NGO world is collapsing. 400 jobs will be lost in France alone in the third sector. But at the grassroots level, there's really awakening. Just from my own experience, I went to Barcelona, 3 co-working centers. I went back 3 years later, 50. Hacker spaces in Vienna, 1, 3 years later, 15, with a rural network called Otello. Whatever aspect of this kind of peer-to-peer thing you take, you will see there's really an enormous and very much alive growth of initiatives. I just want to give you maybe 2 examples from a trip 2 years ago in Brazil to show you how people are really rethinking systems from a commons point of view. The first one is Curto Café. I'm a big fan of them since they gave me a bottle of coffee with my name on it. So I have a conflict of interest here. But just let me tell you their story, because it's really interesting how they conceived of making coffee in a way which I think was unimaginable even 15 years ago. So this is what they did. So this was a person who used to work for a big coffee company, and about 15, 20 years ago, he noticed 2 things that he didn't like. One was you couldn't drink good coffee in Brazil because they have A, B, C, D categories, and A and B go to the west, and so they're stuck with C and D. So here you are in a country making the best coffee in the world, and you can't find any good coffee. The second problem, of course, is much more serious, is that the people who actually make the coffee were starving. So the actual money that actually goes to the producers of the coffee was really marginal in this whole supply chain. So here's the question he asked himself: can we make good coffee without exploiting the primary producers, right? So that question alone is a revolution. You're not asking yourself, how do I make money with making coffee? So it's not exchange value oriented, it's oriented towards a use value, making good coffee, and in socially just conditions. So how would you do that? Well, the first thing they did is they decided that certification wouldn't work because it's too expensive. You probably also know there is a study in the UK showing that 75% of fair trade coffee isn't really fair trade, right? So even with a certification, it can be gamed. So what's the solution? The solution is transparency. Open supply chains and open book accounting. You just show what you do. So you just use the internet, Facebook, they use Facebook, I'm sorry to say, but they use all kinds of networks simply to show what they're doing. That's why it's probably difficult to find on internet. Oh, you did find it actually. All right. Um, so, who are we buying the coffee from? How much are we paying them? That was the first step. Second step was creating a knowledge commons. So all the blends of coffee that were available at the time when I was there, only 4, are published, what kind of grains they use and how they mix them. So anybody else can do the same, take their coffee, mix it differently, and invent new blends, right? So a knowledge comes about coffee creation. By the way, they also, very importantly, what they did was they looked at the machinery and they kind of made a machine, I haven't seen it, but that allows the primary producers to, to burn their own coffee, right? So only by this they can augment their income with about 50% because they're not just producing it, they're also preparing it for the market. Third step is also quite interesting. They do crowd-funded retail expansion. So what it means is they just ask their community of coffee lovers, do you want us to be present in this neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro? And when people say yes, they say, well, it will cost you, $20,000 for 3 years, whatever the price is. And they get small donations, and they get the money, and they pay the rent, and the people who invest in this rent get free coffee for the next 3 years. So the same system is used very successfully in Germany with the energy cooperatives. And then they hacked the Nespresso machine so that you can change the little cups yourself and you don't have to buy the expensive ones. But I'm hoping in the little story that you can see how you can rethink everything. This is not a company making coffee and selling it for a profit. I don't even know what to call it. It's a community. It's a community without the difference between producers and consumers, where everybody's contributing to the knowledge, where the suppliers are in direct contact with the consumers, etc., etc. So this is just one example. Maybe another one also from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, a bit more controversial. It's called Fora do Eixo. And this started in the northeastern state of Pernambuco, in a city where musicians couldn't make a living, couldn't even produce their own music. So a group of young people decided to mutualize the infrastructures for music making. So they invested in a studio and they organized festivals and concerts. Today they have about 300 communities, 15 communes, a credit card with 4 different monetary systems that are not the real. And they basically create a huge network of music makers and livelihoods for musicians totally outside of the music industry. Now, some people have accused them of network imperialism because they take a lot of space. Of course, if you're a Ministry of Culture and you have to subdivide the money into 300 places, or you have one player comes to you and says, we have 300 sites, so they're getting money also for the government, which other people critique. But I just wanted to show you the example as, again, a total rethinking of how music could function. Now, in my view, there's 3 basic important reactions that are taking place faced with the problems of the dominant system. One is sustainability. Think about all the people doing circular economy, the blue economy, and all kinds of projects like that. The second one is social justice concerns. So you have cooperatives are re-emerging, you have the solidarity economy, you have social entrepreneurship, you have B corporations. All kinds of new formats are being invented to allow people to do something about social issues and to distribute the proceeds in a different way. And the third one is, of course, this big push towards sharing and the commons itself. So the open models, the commons models, the peer-to-peer models. So here's the problem, though. Even though a lot of people are doing this, they're doing it separately, right? So you go to a typical town, and you will find an energy co-op, you'll find a food co-op, you'll find a credit union, you'll find a time bank. But what else do you notice? Well, you notice they don't work together, right? So this is, I think, a big issue. First of all, that within even one reaction, sustainability, solidarity, and sharing, there is no real cooperation at this stage. So we're at a time frame of an exponential rise in initiatives, but not yet really efforts at integration. I think this is something quite important. So one of the things we do in our work at the P2P Foundation is trying to build bridges, for example. So we have a project called Open Cooperativism. So we want cooperatives to actually create commons. Yeah, think about Mondragon, great co-op, 200,000-300,000 people, but when they go to Poland, they hire people at a minimum wage because they don't want to dilute their bonuses. As opposed to a model where you could say, instead of just working for our own consumers or producers as a co-op, we actually create commons. So you can do that by adopting open licenses, or you can even create physical commons. Example, there's a housing co-op in Quito that requires 100 hours of community work from its members, and they clean up the ravines around their housing estate, and then they give it as a public park. So they're not just working for themselves as co-op members, they're actually creating a common good that is available to all citizens. So this is what we mean by open co-ops. And we also have a project called Copy Fair, which is a new license which I think is going to be necessary for the solidarity economy and the cooperative economy. What's the problem here? Just very quickly, if you use open licenses that everybody can use, what you see is that big business dominates that economy. So we have an open economy in free software, but it's dominated by big companies like IBM. Now, if you don't think that's a problem, that's fine. But if you think that's a problem, and it may not be a problem for software, but think about hardware, think about physical production. In physical production, I need to invest in space, in machines, in raw materials. So if you're a small solidarity economy entity, you worry about this. You worry about big companies swooping in and basically taking over that market. So one of the things that we propose is a copy fair license, which basically says everybody can share. There is no limitation on sharing the knowledge, reusing and rebuilding the knowledge. But if you want to commercialize, you also need to contribute. So just a suggestion of a possible way of thinking about this. So the good news is that, despite what I said, that that we are still in this kind of period where people are doing individual initiatives, but they're actually starting to find each other. Two examples where I think they're doing it quite well. One is in Madison, Wisconsin, and it's called a Mutual Aid Network. In Madison, they have a really well-functioning time bank. They have a strong credit union, and they have fantastic food co-ops. You drool when you go in. But they're not working together, or they were not working together. So the Mutual Aid Network is a project that started 4 years ago with Stephanie Rierick that aims to create a value stream between these entities. So here's the question: can we use our time banks to go to the food co-op? Can we use our time bank dollars to go to the food co-op? Can we use the script stamps that we get from the food co-op maybe to get some arrangement with the credit union? So I hope you see where I'm getting at. And a similar project is called encommun.org. It's in Lille, in northern France. And their project there is started with mapping common good institutions, commons producing entities. So they look at who are those entities. What immaterial commons do they have? Knowledge commons, technical commons, science commons. And the third one is material commons. And then they look at the flows between them, right? So I think this is a very important way to get at a meta level, right? To get at an integration level where you, as a group of citizens, you consciously think through resilience, as Dugald studied in 2012. Now, okay, let me give you another example which I really like. This is in France, and you will see there are not much cultural examples, so I'll end with culture at the end, because I'm not a very cultural person, haha. So this is Atelier Paysan. It's a network of eco-farmers in France, and it costs about 15,000 euro to buy a particular machine that they need. It's way too expensive for small farmers. So what do? Well, they hold workshops every other week or so. the farmer pays €1,000. That may sound expensive, but at the end of the week of that workshop, he has his machine. They're making their own machines and they're sharing their designs over the internet. And there's many groups like that, like the Nutrient Dense Project, Farm Hack, Slow Tools Project, and others, Open Source Ecology, that do the same kind of thing. So people are actually now really thinking about material provisioning. And this is something maybe now we switch to politics. As some of you may know, we worked in Ecuador for 6 months last year, something called Flock Society Project, Free, Libre, Open Software Knowledge, Open Knowledge Project, Society Project. So the idea was that since these countries are so heavily dependent on extractivist income, oil, agriculture, and have very few industry, that they would switch to a dependence on infinite knowledge rather than finite material resources. So what we looked at was, okay, so how can we imagine a society that works around shared commons? Knowledge commons, science commons, technology commons, industrial commons, agricultural commons. So we looked at the feeding mechanisms. For example, if you want open science, you need open access publishing, otherwise people can't access the data. Then we looked at the material commons. If you switch from proprietary labs, scientific labs, to open source labs, you can have 4 times more labs for the same investment. You probably know this. On average, open hardware is about 1/8 of the cost of commercial hardware for the same level of quality, right? So if you switch to systematically to a vision of open source machinery, you can become much more resilient by keeping the value streams within the commons sphere. But you will notice that the weakness of the Flock project was that we looked at immaterial commons and material conditions for the immaterial commons. I think this is the limitation. I think what we need to do now is go straight to the material commons. For example, community land trusts. What does it mean if we take urban land out of the market so that it keeps a low value for renters, and so that artists and culture makers can actually live in the cities without leaving 5 minutes left? And what does it mean if we look at money as a commons? We look at our monetary system as a commons. So I think this is the phase which we are working on now. And we have a site called commonstransition.org that is basically a depository or an open participatory platform for everyone working on policies for the commons, right? Okay, so how do we get a voice? Because I think this is something very important. Think about what happened in the US and the UK just recently, right? You have Bernie Sanders, an old leftist from the Socialist Republic of Vermont, who suddenly gets 10 times more people at his rallies than Hillary Clinton, systematically. We have Corbyn, who was really registered a few days before the deadline because the right wing felt they should have a left wing candidate to give the impression of a fair election. Suddenly finds that 600,000 people joined the party and started voting for him. I think what it shows is there's a huge amount of people searching for alternatives, and they find it in these parties, but they're very imperfect vehicles for the new kind of commons subjectivity and culture. So while I think we should certainly use these energies that are available, when people are moving in such huge numbers, it's not something I think we want to stay aside from. We have to be part of the conversation. At the same time, I call on people that were active around the commons to work on assemblies and chambers of the commons. On October 10, Le Temps des Communs is a French festival in the Francophone world. There will be a few launches of Assemblée des Communs. I think maybe Frédéric knows more about it than me. So the guy with the beard there, if you're interested in similar initiatives, also in Chicago there will be a Chamber of the Commons. What's the difference? Assemblies for citizens and chambers for ethical market entities that create livelihoods around commons-based peer production. So I'm concluding here with words about culture. I'm missing something, and I have to admit I'm not a person who is kind of naturally drawn to culture. As a I don't know why, it's just not there. But when I was young, in the 70s, we had a very strong culture around progressive political movements. We had rock and roll. And so what I'm noticing is that either I don't see it or we don't have it, right? I don't see today a vibrant, as yet, cultural expression of this move towards the commons. At a moment where even the city of Malmo had a survey where 48% of the population declared they were co-producing commons. Imagine that. So we're not talking about a minority here. We're talking about a new subjectivity where people actually see the commons as part of their identity, and yet I don't feel we see it in culture. So this is kind of my appeal to you guys, because you're active in the cultural world. Maybe you should be helping out and connect more with the physical communities, with the people who are producing livelihoods. You're creating organic food, renewable energy, creating direct connections with farm producers, and all of these efforts that are being made today for resilient society and a resilient economy. And where's the place of culture? Now, one of the, maybe, and then I'm really stopping, is, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but I'll mention it because I think it's a key. It's what we call open source third places, right? This is a French term that I really like for co-working spaces that are not commercial, but are either associatively or corporately managed. I think this is going to be the cauldron. Is that a good word in English? It's used in alchemy, the place where everything happens, right? So I think we need places where the culture of the commons can grow, but can also connect to the communities who are producing value. Because this is my point of view. If we don't change the very mode of production, how we create value, how we distribute value, we can change a lot of things in the margins, but as long as we don't change that, we're nowhere. Now, the good news is that a lot of people are working on it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michel. So I think one of the themes that's already emerging is that we need the rock and roll with which to build this city. And thank you, Patrick, for
Kevin.
DJ. Kevin. Where did I get Patrick from? For DJing silently in the background. We have time for 2 questions. Is anyone sitting there with their question ready to go? Or yes, Paul.
Thanks very much. Very interesting talk. The question at the end about culture, I think, is very important. That you say you're not a culturally inclined person. So for you, I'll say that all again. Thank you. You say that culture is very important, which I think most people here would agree with, but you're not a culturally inclined person yourself. If we assume that quite a lot of people are not culturally inclined as you are, what role does culture play for you in this new space of the commons? What do you want from it? What would you like to see from it?
Well, I can give you an example. I was in Alternativa yesterday, which is a roaming festival of alternatives, mostly in the Francophone world and especially in France. And I was in Genève, and it was a huge success. But there was no attention paid to cultural expression. It just wasn't there. And so, I'm looking for festivals as a start. Festivals where on the one hand, there's so many musicians using Creative Commons. Having Commons part of their work. There is so many people using Creative Commons for writing. There's poetry. There's so many documentaries coming out nowadays through crowdfunding, and they were not there. So I think there is a kind of a disconnect between the world of creative expression that may use the commons in their own work, and then a world of political and economic alternatives. And what I'm calling for is kind of a convergence between those two worlds to give an attractive voice to this emerging new reality.
So one more question. Put your hand up high and wave it around if you have a question. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, I have a question then to finish on. Okay. You said at the beginning, Michel, that you are an inveterate optimist. And I noticed how many of the examples that you gave us didn't come from Europe. And I know that you don't live in Europe. Is it easier to be an optimist in other parts of the world than it is in Europe?
Well, I'm a self-confessed refugee of Western civilization because I left 15 years ago in 2002, and I really had the impression at that time that there was nothing was happening. I mean, maybe in Belgium it's a bit special, but I really had that impression. But guess what? This is the place where it's happening now, seriously. Whether you go to Greece or Spain or Italy, even France, I mean, it has nothing to do with the political situation. I mean, you have horrible governments in most places right now, but that doesn't mean that the citizens are not doing anything. It's just that the media are not reporting it. But there is a true civic renaissance, and it usually starts with conversations, people saying, we can't go on like this. And then I go back 2 years later, the same place. I'll give you an example. This is not a European example, but I went to Melbourne, and I went there for 20 days, and I had 6 conferences. And then 2 years later, I went for 10 days, and I had 20 lectures. The first time, people were asking me all kind of questions. The second time, everybody who was there was doing stuff, and they were just kind of more in need of an integrative narrative. But they were doing stuff. They were all doing stuff. And I think this is happening all over in European cities. But what is maybe lacking is this kind of convergence, conversation between initiatives. So Alternative is actually a good example of a first attempt to do that, where all the people, in alternative production methods actually come together. But we need much more of this kind of mixing and merging of initiatives than we have now. But it's happening, certainly.
Great. Thank you, Michel. That was a very inspiring injection into our proceedings. Yeah, let's...